Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Stephen James, and it's a pleasure to see you. I'll be your docent for the next several presentations on the topic of obscure facts and intriguing history about our travels. I should tell you for full disclosure that when I originally constructed this presentation, the title was just a tad bit shorter. I entitled it Intriguing History About Our Travels. However, I asked some friends and family to review the deck, and they came back and they said for fair balance, I should add the words obscure facts and to intriguing history about our travels. I think the obscure facts are actually quite intriguing by themselves, but I'll let you be the judge of that. So this brings us to a very obvious question. What the heck is a docent? Well, it's derived from the Latin docens or doceo, and it means to teach. It also is the origin of the word doctor in English. The second question it raises is, why is Stephen James a docent? Well, I'm a published medical doctor and psychiatrist for over 3 decades, and I've had experience in medical research and teaching during that time. I'm also an amateur historian and storyteller, and I'm happily retired in Southern California. One thing I'm very certain about today is that all of us, including myself, were very excited to board the ship and begin our cruise. Now, some of us had to come from very long distances. I wonder, could I see a show of hands in the audience, how many people had to be in an airplane for at least 5 hours in order to get to the cruise? Quite a lot. I'm very sorry for you. Please accept my condolences. When I ask you for 5 hours, let me better define that for you. I don't mean the time it took to get to the airport or to check in your luggage or go through security or go to the gate and wait, hoping and praying that your flight wasn't delayed or canceled because of some equipment issue or weather issue. How many actually sat in a seat on a plane and flew, surprising as it is, flew for at least 5 hours? Let me see a show of hands for that. Well, it seems like a very large number again. You know, my own experience, my own journey was that I flew from San Diego, California to the port where I boarded this ship, and it was much longer than 5 hours. Now, in my lifetime, I've had many flights longer than 5 hours and many flights less than 5 hours. And I can tell you almost all of them are not very memorable and hopefully, thankfully, forgettable. However, I'd like to tell you one flight I took many years ago that has kind of stuck with me all this time. And I think there are some learnings associated with it, so I'll share it with you anyway. So about 30 years ago, I was a very young man about to fly to my first medical meeting to present my data. This is very important to me, and I lived in Washington, D.C., and I bought a ticket to fly from Washington to Chicago where the meeting was. It was scheduled in the spring, May the 15th. I'll never forget the date. And so I went to the airport and boarded the plane about 1 o'clock. It was scheduled to depart around 1:30, 1:45. And I got into my seat, and all of a sudden, about 1:30, the pilot comes on the PA and says, "Our flight will be delayed to Chicago because of bad weather. Please stand by." Well, 30 minutes later, the flight attendant comes on and says, "Our delay is a little bit longer than we figured, and so we're going to play a game to make sure that you're all very comfortable and enjoying your stay with our airline." And so the contest was that whoever could predict the time of departure would win a bottle of champagne, and they could toast themselves tonight. And so the flight attendant came down the aisle, gave people out paper and pencil, asked them to record their seat number, and also the time they felt the plane was going to depart from Washington. I thought it would be maybe 3:30, maybe a 2-hour delay on the ground. It was a beautiful spring day. It's been beautiful for weeks. Spring in Washington is a wonderful time with the warmth and the cherry blossoms by the tidal basin, and so I thought 3:30 and thought I had a good chance of toasting myself that evening. Well, we sat and we sat and we sat, and finally, about 5:15, 5:20, the flight attendant announced, "Buckle your seatbelts, we're leaving soon." Then they announced the winner once we were airborne, and it was the gentleman next to me. The flight attendant then walked grandly down the aisle with a lot of ceremony, handed the bottle to the gentleman, and shook his hand amid applause from the rest of the passengers. After it had slowed down a little bit in the cabin, I asked the gentleman, "How did you decide that we would be leaving at 5:15? And he said, "You have to remember, I wasn't guessing the time, I was guessing the date." You see, sometimes we get the right answers for all the wrong reasons. I long since forgot the meeting and what I said and who I met with, but I've always remembered that learning point, that kind of anecdote, if you will, on the journey to Chicago. Now, since that flight from Washington to Chicago, I probably have been on thousands of flights, and most of them, thankfully, I have forgotten about. And most of the meetings I went to, I have forgotten about, mercifully. But still, there are those odd events that occur on the journey to someplace on a plane that I still remember. I started cruising about 20 years ago, and I've now been on maybe a dozen or so cruises. And I found that sometimes I remember the flight took me to the port so I could board the ship. Most times, thankfully, I forget that flight, but I have never forgotten any cruise that I've been on and the places I've been. And it reminded me of a quotation from Miguel de Cervantes, the author of Don Quixote, where he wrote, "The journey is better than the inn." And I think that's absolutely true about cruising. And I hope that this cruise that you're on today will be very memorable, and that you will recall this over and over again over many years about the wonderful things you saw and the things that you learned. And now I'd like to tell you one final story. Franz Kafka was a major literary character of the 20th century. He died at the age of 40 of tuberculosis after a life that was very lonely and disappointing to him. Many of his writings were lost to us for a variety of reasons, which we'll talk about in another presentation. But overall, Kafka felt his life had been a failure. One day before his death, he was walking in the park in Berlin with his companion, Dora, when he came across a little girl who was crying. "What's your name, little girl?" Franz Kafka asked. And the little girl replied, "Irma." And she said, "Have you seen my doll? I've lost my doll, and I'm very, very sad." Kafka said he hadn't seen the doll, but he spent the rest of the afternoon with Irma in the park looking for it. At the end of the day, they didn't find the doll, and so he said, "I'll come back tomorrow and help you look again." The following morning, Franz Kafka appeared at the park, but this time he had a letter. He told the little girl, Irma, that he received a letter from the doll that was addressed to her to read. "Why did the doll send you a letter?" Irma said. "Because I'm the postman," he said. So Irma opened the letter and read it, and it said from the doll, "I am sorry I left you. I know you're sad, but I had to see the world. There are so many beautiful things to do. I will send you stories around the world of all the things that I have seen to warm your heart." And with that, the little girl went home, consoled that her doll would be in touch with her. Over the next year, Franz Kafka met Irma many times in the park, and each time he gave her a letter from the doll. And each time Kafka would return to the park and see Irma, he would present a letter to her which she would open and read about a beautiful story where the doll had traveled. It could be the Wall of China, it could be Persia, it may be India, It could be many wonderful places in the world with incredible stories that delighted little Irma. One day, Kafka came to the park and gave her instead a doll. "Your doll has returned, Irma," he said. Irma looked at the doll and shook her head and said, "This is not my doll. I'm not happy. This is not my doll at all." And then Kafka gave her another letter and said, "Please open this." And she opened the letter, and it was from the doll, and it said, "My travels have changed me, but I've always loved you the same." Well, as you might imagine, Irma was just ecstatic, and she went home to a happy home for the first time in many, many months after losing her doll. That's about the end of the story as we know it. This story was called Letters from the Doll, and we know that there was more to it, but it was lost in history. The version which I like goes as follows. Irma grows up to be a beautiful young woman, and she takes her doll with her everywhere. One day, while strolling through the park, Irma dropped the doll and it broke. Irma was very sad and reached down to pick up the doll and noticed that inside there was a letter. And she grabbed the letter and opened it up, and it said the following: "Almost everything you love in life and cherish will be lost." In this little story, we learn about the sadness which accompanies loss. The little girl begins to feel connected to her doll by receiving letters describing wonderful trips and new adventures. Over the past 20 years, I've been blessed to be able to cruise. I've met the most interesting people in the world. I've seen destinations that I could only have read about before. And during this time, I have learned a great deal about myself and had experiences which I could only have imagined. I think this has made me a much better person. I hope that these discussions and the people that you meet on this cruise and the destinations that we visit will have a similar benefit on you as well. Thank you for coming. Have a nice cruise.